תל אביב 360, ערוץ הפודקאסטים של אוניברסיטת תל אביב.
It's a great pleasure and a treat to have Franklin Foer with us here in Tel Aviv University's 360 podcast. It's in collaboration with the Center for the Study of the United States here at Tel Aviv University, which I head. I'm Dr. Yoav Fromer, and it's a great treat to have Franklin here with us from the United States. So welcome, Franklin.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Great. So I'll just give a short introduction, and we'll get to it. Franklin Foer is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. And before that, A World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. He was previously editor of The New Republic during its golden age, I must add, and the staff writer at Slate and New York Magazine. His other books include How Soccer Explains the World and Jewish Jocks, co-edited with Mark Tracy, and it won a National Jewish Book Award. So we're very glad to have him here, and we're going to talk. There's a lot to talk about, but I want to start with your work at The Atlantic, right? And you've written some really important, influential articles over the past, in many years, but specifically in the last year that I want to focus on. Yeah. First and foremost, I think, is the article about, right, the war that wouldn't end. Right?
That would not end.
That would not end, right? And of course, it's unfortunate. It's about the Gaza War and everything that's happened since October 7th. And I think Franklin has done more comprehensive reporting about what's happening behind the scenes, what happened during this painful year and a half. And I think we want to hear a lot of his insights from that. So I want to begin where you begin your article, and it's on October 6th, right? It's kind of the night before the October 7th terror attacks. How close was the United States, right, to kind of engineering this historic deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel that might have also led to everything that unfolded afterwards?
They were optimistic about it. They had done a lot of the spade work for it, especially in terms of negotiating with the Saudi Arabians. Like the Saudis were on board with a normalization deal, and that they, one of the conditions of that deal was that Israel had to make certain commitments to a Palestinian state. And those were being outlined in very, very specific detail. They hadn't really worked this through with Netanyahu at that stage. And Netanyahu kept giving off very, very positive signs that he was committed to making this happen. He would say that he was willing to commit to some form of Palestinian statehood, but that he would have to wordsmith the language, that it would take some finessing. And so would it have happened? I don't know. But there was a vision. It was comprehensive. It was well articulated. But the difficult politics still were in front of it.
And I mean, because just from, right, because much of this is based on your extensive reporting, right, both, I think, in the Biden administration, but also with Israeli sources, right? And did you get the sense that the Americans, right, were actually, that it wasn't just talk, that this time maybe something was on the table that would have actually, produced this historic agreement?
I think it was plausible. I do think it was plausible because I think that the demands that the Saudis were making were not that extreme. I mean, I think I quote in my piece ultimately Mohammed bin Salman saying he doesn't care that much about the Palestinians.
That struck me. That was remarkable.
Yeah. And I heard more about that as I went along, that he had a teacher, in fact, who was Palestinian and who he didn't like. And that colored a lot of his views in general, in addition to just being kind of frustrated in kind of his dealings with the PA over time. But so there wasn't a high cost that the Saudis were asking for. I think that it would have been one that Netanyahu would have absorbed some political hit for at home in terms of his coalition, but it was clearly within the realm of doable, just as a practical matter. They weren't asking for great sacrifices. They weren't asking for him to make extreme commitments of money or security in the course of doing this. It was all a very gradual process that they were proposing.
And again, but that always, and it struck me throughout the article that it always comes back to Netanyahu and his personal political challenges within this very right-wing coalition. Also later on, right after the attacks, and again, I think that's a great. Would he have, on October 6th, if there was a deal on the table, would he have told Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, right, the two more right-wing, hardcore kind of opposition to any kind of negotiation process, would he have...
What Netanyahu was privately telling Biden, and this goes back maybe January 2023, he talked to Biden and he told Biden, look, I want to do this, and if it forces me to get out of bed with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, then that's fine. I can find a coalition in the center. And so before October 7th, I think the theory within Washington and maybe even within Jerusalem was that there was some grand bargain to be had, that Netanyahu would maybe extract some promise of immunity for entering into a coalition with the centrists, but that there was a deal that he'd be able to broker that would be in his own political self-interest as well as in the nation's interest.
So that's, one of the things that are very important, I think, in reading Franklin's work and this article and the book as well, is that we in Israel, we have a relatively limited scope of how we understand things, just because the Israeli media, with few exceptions, isn't able or willing, for a variety of reasons, to cover certain things that Franklin does flush out. And it's very important, I think, for us to see what actually happens through kind of international sources and the American media and Franklin's work, because you can see that a lot of the narratives that we have in Israel regarding what you just said, regarding the political sphere in Israel and Netanyahu's actions, they're very different. And that's one of the things I enjoyed, I think, and I learned from your reporting. So let's talk about the morning, right? Let's talk about October 7th.
Yes.
How surprised do you think were, first of all, just the American military high command, the intelligence, CIA, and even the administration itself from the events, and also from, we have to concede that from the unprecedented failure of the Israeli kind of military and intelligence and political system that morning.
Yeah, they were completely shocked. They didn't know. They learned about it through the Israelis. The first person in the government to learn about it was Brett McGurk, who works in the National Security Council in the White House, who covers the Middle East for the Biden administration. He got a text from Michael Herzog, the ambassador to Washington, saying, we're under attack. Herzog had heard from a general who called him and said, we're under attack, and then hung up. And so Herzog had to start to Google, what was happening, to go through social media to see what he could detect, then passed it along to the Americans. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, was on vacation in Europe when this happened. He was in the south of France, and he got word of this. And because of the time difference, he was more closely aligned to Israeli time. And so he stays up through the night talking to sources within the Israeli military security establishment, and he calls into the Situation Room in Washington, and he says, "Go through the intelligence. Did we miss anything here? Were there any signs that this was about to happen?" And so they spend the night in Washington time going through the intel, and they didn't see any signs that this was imminent.
And how? I mean, maybe it's too early to think about the long-term effect, but how do you think what happened affected the way that kind of American, especially because the strategic importance of Israel was always rooted, right, kind of in its in its military capabilities, right?
Yeah.
With all due respect to the pro-Israel lobby and domestic politics and even the shared values paradigm.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, right, and this is as a historian, it's important for me to emphasize, it's Israel's strategic and military strength kind of really established after the 1967 war, that was the most important thing for America, strategically speaking. How do you think this war, and especially October 7th, did it undermine it in a obviously in a profound manner that maybe is that they will not be able to correct? Or
I don't think so. And I don't think, at least not in Washington's eyes, I think that maybe there's some evolution in the way that Washington thinks about security in the region that, I think there's a fairly, there was a relationship between CENTCOM, the Central Command of American Military, and the Israeli military that was very deep. And the relationship actually became a pretty mature one over the course of the war. And what you see is that rather than thinking about the Israeli military as this indomitable piece unto itself. It becomes like a pawn on a chessboard, that Israel is integrated into a system that involves American military power in the region, that involves Jordanian Air Force, that involves Saudi Arabian, that there's a coalition that's been assembled to contain Iran. And maybe the Biden administration didn't kind of foresee this as before October 7th, but it evolved in a way that I think becomes a fairly permanent structure, because all these other countries in the Middle East want to be stitched into this patchwork, that when Israel swats away, Israel and the United States swat away the Iranian attacks, that's a demonstration project to the rest of the region. I was in Riyadh. I went into the
when it happened?
No. Sorry. And when just after it happened, I went into
one of the two, right? The two big Iranian kind of missile attacks on Israel.
Went into the Gulf Cooperative Council, and I saw these guys talking, and like they would condemn Israel, but then the next sentence they would kind of be like, "Oh, we want to, we're so impressed by this air defense, and can we get into that deal?"
That's very interesting. But I think so. We are here at some kind of a transformative moment for America's strategic vision in the area, maybe because it was always. Certainly if we're thinking Cold War, but even after Cold War, it was Israel as a pillar, right? And because none of the Arab countries were able to sustain themselves without American defense. We saw that after the first Gulf War in Saudi Arabia, and Jordan has always been reliant on American military support. But Israel was the pillar. Yeah. And now Israel's kind of, for a variety of reasons, but partly, I think, because on October 7th, one of the things, and again, I think Israel is going to have to do some serious strategic soul searching here, is it lost something, maybe even in its deterrent capabilities, despite all the phenomenal success of the missile defense and really the IDF's performance in Gaza and South and Lebanon. But maybe from now on, it's part of something whole, as you suggest, right? And it's not just U.S.-Israel, it's U.S. and this regional strategic alliance where Israel plays a role, a leading role, but it's still a role, one among many others.
Well, I also think that if Israel doesn't attach itself to the Saudi normalization deal, it's going to happen without Israel, and that MBS is a visionary. Whatever one thinks about his government and whatever one thinks about Saudi Arabia, he has a very impressive, very well articulated vision for what Saudi Arabia could become, and it's going to fall into a much deeper relationship with the United States because of economic reasons. That Saudi Arabia was, at the beginning of the Biden administration, it was unclear which way it would go, that it was flirting with an alliance with the Chinese. And it made a decision, I think, after the Ukraine war to kind of align with the United States, that it saw that Russia and China were kind of fickle partners and unreliable. And it also saw that American artificial intelligence was superior to the Chinese version of artificial intelligence. And it came to appreciate certain components of the American economic system, that it decided, okay, we'd rather attach ourselves to the American free market than to the Chinese model. And he's got this vision for how he's going to transform his country. I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole here. We could. No,
but it's fascinating. Where's Israel's place in that? Because Israel can be a partner, but it doesn't have to be, right? From his perspective, I suppose.
Well, Israel technology, for instance, is not that significant to the Saudis. When I'd ask the Saudis about this, like, why do you want to normalize with Israel? They'd say, we could buy anything we want from the Israelis on the open market. We don't need to have a normalized relationship with them. What it comes down to is that essentially they want American air defenses.
Yeah.
Like they want to be stitched into this.
They want a mutual defense pact, right, with the United States.
Yeah.
That's the
and they understand that in order to get that, there needs to be certain political concessions made, because to get a treaty through the U.S. Senate, you need 2/3 vote. In order to get to those 2/3, you need to build a coalition that's bipartisan,
and you need some. Right, something palatable to supporters of Israel, which you have, right, on both parties.
Interestingly, it's about progressives, that they need something they can deliver to progressives. And so if there's a promise of a Palestinian state that's attached to this deal, you can get skeptics of Saudi Arabia on the left to come around. That's the calculation.
So that's the incentive for making certain demands for Palestinian, some kind of political autonomy, not necessarily because they care about it, because they want to get it through the U.S. Senate, and that's very interesting, progressive votes to support that.
And he has a population that's very young and that's watched this war happen and is sympathetic to the Palestinians.
Right. All right. So that's fascinating. So if we look at how the war develops, you write. You call the whole American, the Biden foreign policy in the region since October 7th, right, the anatomy of a failure, right? And I'll just quote one line from it. And you call America under Biden, quote, and I know from having read your book that it's not what you necessarily feel about Biden, but here you write, is America, I think, quote, an overextended superpower with an aging president, right? And this sense that that maybe the last year and a half revealed something about the limitations of American power and influence, at least under Biden.
Yeah, because he had a vision about where he wanted this war to go, where he wanted the region to go, and he was unable to impose that. And I guess the question that I tried to answer is why. He laid out a very clear set of objectives at various stages in the course of the war, and
such as bringing the hostages home.
Yeah, bringing the hostages home. He wanted to have a plan for the post-war in Gaza that involved reconstruction, that involved Saudi Arabia bankrolling reconstruction, and with a coalition of Arab states providing security in Gaza,
replacing Hamas.
He wanted there to be this Saudi normalization deal at the end of it, and some
Palestinian.
Yeah, in some form of Palestinian statehood, and he wasn't able to get any of it.
And all right, so why then? Right, and I think obviously you point to a lot of circumstances, some of them contingencies that were, I suppose, inevitable, but you also point to certain failures of policy.
Yeah,
right,
in that sense. I also, I went back and I reread as I was reporting this article. This Peter Baker and Susan Glasser biography of James Baker, the American Secretary of State, who's, I know, a controversial figure within Israel.
And the more time passes, the more I personally view him favorably. But maybe
he was, when you go back and you look at the way in which he created the conditions that led to the Oslo process, you saw somebody who really knew how to wield power successfully, wield American power, wield presidential power. And I think you see something kind of very different here in the way that Biden wielded power. He was an incredible friend to Israel. I don't think Israelis really are totally appreciative of the way in which
I agree.
He overextended himself on behalf of the country. He never applied significant pressure on Netanyahu to end this war. People talk about the weapons slowdown. He provided Israel the weaponry that it used in order to beat back Hezbollah. He provided the defenses that helped fend off the Iranian attacks. He provided the weaponry and support that allowed them to continue to fight the war in Gaza after almost everybody else in the world wanted Israel to wrap it up.
And he paid a price for it, right?
A huge political price for it. Everywhere he went, he was heckled. I think it's a significant part of the reason why he got pushed out of the race in the end, because there's this narrative where his weakness starts to get exposed, and age is part of that weakness starts to get exposed. And I feel like it begins with, it doesn't begin and end with Gaza. It begins probably with Afghanistan, but it's a data point that people can point to, that he looked like he was getting pushed around by Netanyahu by making all these empty threats and never following through.
And that's something the Israelis, I think still most Israelis are, they admire Biden, and I think there's significant gratitude among most Israelis, but you have these, I don't want to say conspiracy theorists, but a lot of people who support Netanyahu, the second Biden said even something about, looking out for Palestinian human rights or conditioning future weapons sales or shipments on letting in aid or something, then people turned against him here and they said, "Oh, look, Biden is the worst," and that is just. And again, I urge the people who still think that to read Franklin's article, because you see and you get the sense of how committed and devoted he was to Israel at his own peril. And he did pay, I think, a huge price for it. Right?
Yeah, not to commit Tom Friedman style of taxi driver journalism, but just journeying across Israel, talking to everyday people about this, I hear lots of people say, if only Biden hadn't prevented Israel from fighting, right, Israel would have wrapped it up, which is a nonsensical point of view. But Biden is a philo-Semite. Yeah. Biden, he's a very devout Catholic, and I think within the Democratic Party, as it's become more secularized, he's always kind of turned to Jews because he's felt some sort of commonality with them, because they take ritual seriously, they think theologically. And you look at his chiefs of staff; they've often been, more often than not,
lots of Irish Jews. Also, right? Sullivan, he's got a few kind of Irish guys, but yeah.
But it's Ron Klain, it's Jeff Zients, Ted Kaufman was his chief of staff for a very long period of time. Mark Gittenstein was his chief counsel. He's very. He feels very comfortable with Jews, and he makes this joke sometimes when he's talking to Jews. He'll say something like, the thing about our people.
But that's, again, there's something I lament that it's almost this age has passed, right? It's this post-war, right? This brings us to that other article of yours, the end of kind of Jewish America. But it is this moment in the 50s, right, where you have kind of some kind of rapprochement between Catholics and Jews, also because of Vatican II, but also because of changes inside the America, the Catholics and Jews. There's something about that, a very natural and organic connection that I think you point to here.
Yeah, but it's an unrequited love, I think, during the course of this war. I mean, that's the crazy thing. It's like he couldn't, in the history of the American presidency, there are almost no examples of a president who has extended himself as far as Joe Biden has on behalf of Israel.
Literally, right? That flying to Israel and getting that hug from Netanyahu, which I don't know how he felt about that.
But where's the mutuality in this love affair? It's not.
There's no gratitude in politics in general, but unfortunately I say this because previous administrations, you had that. Golda Meir's relationship with a lot of American policymakers, even Nixon and Kissinger, was very different, than.
In my sense, talking to some people within Netanyahu's inner circle, is that they understand that Biden was an unconditional friend and that Trump is a very conditional friend, that there's a transactional nature to those politics. And so, you see right now kind of Netanyahu kind of scrambling to repair his relationship with Trump, because there was that, I think Trump will never forget.
Right. Yeah. He'll never forgive. Right.
That Netanyahu called Biden to congratulate him on winning the 2020 presidential race. That's the sin.
Right.
And he's
loyalty above anything else. Yeah. And right. So I don't know. We'll talk about Trump in a few minutes, I think, but his comments about Israel and Netanyahu have been so all over the place that they should be very disconcerting to a lot of Israelis who are just waiting for Trump as if he's the Messiah, right? They got a lot of, I think that there's always these the Pew Global public opinion polls and everything. It's like Israel is I think more than Trump, right? More than the United States in terms of support for Trump.
Yeah.
I don't remember if there's any other country in the world where Trump has so much public support, including the United States, than in Israel. And again, that I think the next 4 years are actually going to challenge that somewhat, I think, misdirected faith in Trump. But
I think there's some fetishization of strength for strength's sake. That's part of that admiration for Trump that Israelis have. And I think I personally think it's misguided because, projecting an image of strength isn't actually always the same thing as substantive strength. And
which you think Biden had?
No, I think that Biden had vision here, and Biden had strategic impulses, but it wasn't wedded to political strength, which he needed in order to realize his vision.
Trump has that strength, but
Yeah.
he doesn't have the vision or frankly, I don't think he has the interest that much unless it's maybe to get a Nobel Prize, which I think he really wants, right?
I don't know if he cares about the Nobel Prize, but I think he'd like the validation because he's kind of a snob about these sorts of things. Like, he's a populist, but
Obama got the Nobel Prize, so he needs to get that
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. So, all right. So I wanted one more question maybe about this, and then we can talk about the book of it. So can you maybe take us behind the scenes to what really is the nature of the Biden-Netanyahu relationship, and what frankly what do the Biden administration what do they think about Netanyahu's government? Because even this, I think, is, you have rumors and speculation, but I from what I sense, this is, I've been saying this for ages, but I think this that Netanyahu has unfortunately created unreparable damage to the relationship in the long term. And I'm curious, from your reporting, what do they really think about Netanyahu's government?
I mean, interestingly, I think that they have more respect and more understanding for Netanyahu
Really? Wow.
than I think you're probably assuming in that question. That they, I think it depends who you talk to within the administration. I think by the end of by about 6 months into the war, I think Biden was fed up with Netanyahu. That Biden felt like he'd been played by Netanyahu, that he'd been suckered, that Netanyahu had made certain promises to him about the timeline of the war, and he was reneging on those promises. I think that he felt like Netanyahu would tell him one thing in private phone calls and then turn around and do the opposite thing in public. And so Biden, I think, was among the most frustrated with Netanyahu. But when you kind of go deeper into the government and the level of the Jake Sullivans, we mentioned Brett McGurk, the kind of the core Democratic apparatchiks who run foreign policy, I found that they had kind of greater sympathy to Netanyahu and the strategic dilemmas that Israel faced, and felt like, okay, we've looked at these questions about Israel's conduct during the war. There's a lot of things that we don't like, but we also realize that they're being profoundly unfairly criticized for various things. And we're sympathetic to their calculus, and we can understand, I think the greater visibility that they had into Israel's goals and strategic plans, the more sympathy that they had for them.
And for Netanyahu, or maybe.
I think that they, Netanyahu was a reality for them, and so they there was nothing. They figured out how to achieve a modus vivendi with him.
Interesting. So, so just maybe one final question about this. Looking back, what could have been done different in terms of American foreign policy, or maybe there really wasn't? Because I mean, you mentioned, Biden comes out at the very beginning, right, and he warns Hezbollah and Iran don't, right, and he sends the carrier groups, and he furnishes Israel, despite all the war, kind of all the scare tactics here. He furnishes Israel with everything it needs to wage the war. So what then? Where could things have been done different, if at all?
Well, this is with the complete benefit of hindsight.
Right. Yeah, we have that
hindsight that I did not have even when I wrote this piece, because that piece was published in September and a lot's happened since September. But I think in retrospect, on October 11th, a couple of days after the war, Yoav Gallant, other members of the war cabinet wanted to attack Hezbollah preemptively and to fight that war at that time. And I think when I think back to this, I think, okay, given what we know about Israel's war plan against Hezbollah, and given their ability to kind of deter Iran and fend off an Iranian attack, what if very quickly in the war they'd gone and they'd opened up that second front and they'd successfully trounced Hezbollah, which would have restored their sense of kind of security and self-confidence after getting rocked on October 7th? Would that, achieving that victory early in the war, would that have given them the sense of security and the sense of self-confidence to move more quickly within Gaza to negotiate a long-term deal there. So they didn't have to fight kind of an endless war in Gaza that exacted enormous costs on Palestinians, but also on Israeli society, and didn't ultimately, wipe out Hamas.
Yeah. Interesting, right? Because that was a big deal, right? Because that was something I think that Yoav Gallant, as defense minister, and from what I recall in the Israeli press, that many of the Israeli kind of generals, right, and the Israeli army wanted to do, but who stops that? Netanyahu or Biden or both?
I think Netanyahu wasn't keen on doing that at that moment. So he was on the fence. Yeah. And then on that day, Eisenkot and Gantz joined the government. And I don't think that they were persuaded that this was the right thing to do. And, just to go back to that day, one of the things that I report is that Israel was seeing shadows after October 7th.
Right, what was the...
They felt like there were paragliders coming in from the north, and that there were these reports of attacks that actually weren't unfolding. So they didn't have the intelligence to necessarily justify the preemptive strike at that moment.
Right, and just right. So I'll just fill in the blank. And then you say, and then right before they almost make a decision to actually start some kind of hostilities on the northern border, they realize it's a flock of birds.
Yeah,
right. So it's always those, those accidents of history that could have ended up taking us in a very different direction. All right. So I want to talk a bit about the book. Right, The Last Politician Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. What do you mean by Biden as the last politician?
So Biden, I think, as the title implies, comes from a different age of American politics, that he's somebody who grew up in the post-war era, who came of age politically in the shadow of the Kennedys. He's somebody who was a creature of the U.S. Senate. He came to the Senate in 1973. It's insane. He's been there that long. He's been in American politics that long. And his view of how America could save its democracy was that it needed to prove that politics was still a very effective way of resolving all of the massive differences in American society. As America became more polarized, as politics became more violent and contentious, there was still this way of compromising, of haggling, of
great myth of compromise, right? Before the age of social media,
right?
So Biden for you is that.
Yeah,
but there's something very anachronistic then about.
There's something anachronistic. Well, I mean, yes and no. Like, on the one hand, he did show that politics was still effective because he was able to broker like a fairly significant amount of bipartisan legislation.
So you remind us of some of those. People totally forgot about them. Those were significant legislative achievements, right?
Yeah. So in 2020, 2022, he has this massive. He signs into law an infrastructure bill that makes the biggest investment in American infrastructure
with Republican votes in the Senate.
With Republican votes in the Senate, biggest investment in infrastructure since the Eisenhower administration. He signs into law the CHIPS Act, which makes massive investments in the American semiconductor industry, but also in the same sort of way that the infrastructure bill harkens back to kind of Cold War legislation. The CHIPS Act also includes investments in basic science, R&D, and science education.
It's also meant to contain China, or at least the Chinese technological power.
Counter China. Yeah. He passes NATO expansion. He passes a bill that gives money to deal with burn pits and victims of burn pits in the U.S. military. In addition to the big, there are these other pieces of legislation that can be passed on a pure party line basis called reconciliation bills. And he manages to get two really massive reconciliation bills through the Congress. The first is a relief bill that's passed in the shadow of COVID.
Right, the CARE Act. Right.
The CARE Act that does, it's not the CARE Act, it's the Recovery Act. And it does a lot to expand and test the limits of the American social safety net, including giving a lot of direct payments to poor Americans, testing kind of the idea of basic income. And then he passes, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a terrible name, but makes all of these big investments in green energy.
Right, yeah. I mean, but everything you just said, why, this is a large group, but why doesn't he get credit for it? Because he in a way, Kamala Harris's loss was also his loss, right?
Yes, of course.
And everything you just said, I would wager most Israelis, but also most Americans, they forgot, or maybe they didn't even know about all of these legislative successes. So what happened in that sense? What is left of his legacy, in your opinion?
All right. So why doesn't he get credit? I think there are a couple of reasons. The first is that there is the American media is broken, and
you're saying this as someone who's your entire life is in the American media, right?
Yeah. In an unbroken part of it, must be said, that there's not an authoritative source of information that people have about what's going on. Secondly, I think because of his age, he was not an energetic messenger, and he never figured out how to package and sell and market his achievements to the American people. And then thirdly, these investments are investments in the long term. Right. That's what makes them good investments in theory, but they didn't really respond to the immediate problems that people were facing, which were higher prices. Now, this legacy looks great in the moment, but the election of Donald Trump means that a lot of it is extremely vulnerable. Yeah. That the clean energy parts of this are things that Trump is dead set on reversing. NATO expansion was a great thing, but Trump could destroy NATO. And so, in the end, Biden's inability to market his agenda, Biden's unwillingness to get out of the race and to that's his legacy.
And the pardoning, I think, of Hunter Biden was. Do you think that? Because that was very distasteful.
It's a terrible decision to make. I think that's something for paragraph 7 of his obituary, but it's not. He vowed that he was not going to pardon Hunter Biden, and then he turned around and did it, and that looks like a massive lie or a massive piece of hypocrisy. And he positions himself as a defender of the rule of law, and then when you're the president, that job comes before the job of being a father. And so even if you could have some sympathy to him as a father wanting to protect his son, that's not the role.
Do you think, and that we're starting to wrap up here, but I just have a couple of final questions. Do you think that fed into why Harris lost and lost in a pretty resounding manner, I think? Because does she pay the price for some of Biden's failures, including the failure not to get out, giving her enough time to campaign?
So that's a counterfactual, and we don't know the answer. Right. Was it possible if Kamala Harris had another 6 months to run for president, could she have done a better job? Hard to say. If there had been an open primary, could the Democrats have selected somebody who was a better candidate than Kamala Harris? Plausible, but not a slam dunk. I think about what a primary might have looked like in the shadow of the Gaza War, with all these debates that tend to break out in a Democratic primary between the left and the center. Those could be very ugly. They could have I couldn't say for sure how that would play out. But what I do know is that Biden's decision to stay in the race as long as he did was a very selfish decision, and it essentially doomed the party to its defeat. He didn't leave them enough time and opportunity to come up with a better alternative.
Right. It's so tragic, right, in the classical manner, because he was an unselfish president in many ways, and he did so much. And you mentioned many of these bills that did end up helping so many Americans, and it's in that final few months that he makes these terrible decisions for which he'll be remembered. Right?
Yeah. Well, he overestimated himself. That was the sin.
That's always hubris, right?
It's hubris. He was unable to he personally was not able to see how he had aged, and he was not able to see the fact that he was a politically toxic candidate. He wasn't able to see that the country wasn't buying what he was selling, and therefore wasn't able to make the correct common sense political decision. I think the thing in the end is that it was a collective failure. It wasn't just Joe Biden's failure. And I never said this in public, but it was, it's nuts. The idea of having an 86-year-old president, I mean, maybe I did say this in public from time to time, but the idea of having an 86-year-old president is insane. Yeah. And somebody should have stood up and said, look, thank you, Joe, but it's time to move on. And when they did do that, when they did have that intervention, it was too late.
Yeah. Right, so one final question, and then we'll wrap up because we can't not talk about his replacement, right? And his arch enemy, right? A nemesis, kind of the return of Donald J. Trump, which is happening in a few days from now. And I know. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to speculate because with Trump, no one can, not even a psychiatrist can speculate what's going to happen, right? I don't think Trump himself knows. You mentioned his lack of vision. Right, everything is so transactional and mercurial with Trump. But just looking at the cabinet, which I know you've written about this, right, and the people surrounding him and his statements about how he's going to govern and his vision for America in the next 4 years. What is your sense about the return of Trump and what that means for America? I know this is a very wide question to end on, but optimism, skepticism. How do you see America moving forward now?
So during the first Trump administration, American institutions were tested, and they proved to be pretty resilient in the face of a lot of his challenges to the rule of law, to norms, to the American way of doing things. And at this time around, I think those institutions are fundamentally weaker. That media is weaker than it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago. The courts have shifted further to the right because of Trump's appointments. The Democratic Party is actually weaker right now in the face of Trump because there's this sense of apathy and resignation that runs so rampant, total defeat. And so I think that he has much greater runway to impose his personal predilections on the system,
whatever they might be,
to change the system, which means that I think the possibility of him exacting revenge against old enemies increases. Like his ability to transform the bureaucracy and the civil servant, the so-called deep state, to bend it to his will. That's much greater than it was 8 years ago. So, my sense is that he stands to be a genuinely transformational president. That I think that he, the last time Paul Krugman came up with this phrase that it was malevolence tempered by incompetence. No. And now I don't think that there's anything tempering it.
So, all right. So I'll just conclude with one question, which I'm sure a lot of listeners do have, and it's always that question of, so many Israelis are literally waiting for Trump to come back. Really, it's almost this Messiah complex, thinking that now everything's going to be better, and the Iranians are going to be in big trouble, and Hamas and Hezbollah are not gonna are going to be terrified of him. Do you think that's a correct assessment, or do you think Israelis should actually have a bit of more modesty and maybe think twice before celebrating Trump's return to the White House?
I'm not really positive because I think that there's going to be I think the Gulf states and these investors and his family businesses and these people that he listens to have a different view of the world than they did in 2016. I mean, they're much more inclined towards brokering some rapprochement with Iran right now. They would like to see Trump apply much more pressure on the Israelis to address the Palestinian situation. So there are cross currents for Trump as he moves through the Middle East. And I think it would be naive to assume that he's just going to do what Israelis want when he has these other constituents in the region.
And that is, I think, a very important point and a good one to end on, that we should think again, right, what Trump might be. thinking about, especially given his new connections and growing connections with a variety of Arab actors, right? Not just kind of Israeli ones. So, all right. So great. So I want to thank Franklin for joining us today and read the book. It's a wonderful book, The Last Politician. That's it. Thank you very much for joining us.
תל אביב 360, ערוץ הפודקאסטים של אוניברסיטת תל אביב.